Now, after his tour of duty as state treasurer of Oregon, he has come back to Portland as mayor to help us get the city back together. Please join us and join me in providing a warm welcome for Mayor Ted David.
That was a very kind introduction, and if I were a better politician, I'd say thank you and I would sit down and just let that be the last word. The good news is there's a gentleman here filming all of this, and I want to make sure I get a clip of that for my wife, especially the part where she said, and he actually listens. That's the part I want her to hear. So thank you, and it's great to be back here at the Rose City Park Association. I want to thank you for all the work you do. As you know, I'm a huge fan of the Neighborhood Association Network. I think this is one of the most important ways that we as a community are heard and have our interests reflected, and it's an opportunity to get to know the neighbors. As you may be aware, you're facing an uphill trend. Increasingly, technology and just the lack of civility in our society is really robbing us of opportunities to come together and problem solve as neighbors, and to look each other in the eye and have conversations and get to know the people next door and down the block and across the street. So I really applaud opportunities like this to get to do that. Now, I was asked, in the spirit of my former self as the state treasurer, if I could give a 2-hour just sort of introduction on where I'm headed, with a heavy focus on our bonding capacity and what we intend to do with refinancing strategies. So I'll start with that. Oh wait, no, this is the wrong room, I forgot. So I was asked if I could just sort of do a brief summary of where we're headed. I really don't want to do that because I frankly want this to be your time, and I know there's comments people have and questions people will ask, and I'll do my best to answer whatever questions you throw my way, and what questions I can't answer. Mr. Nathan Howard, give a big wave. Mr. Nathan Howard will endeavor to connect with you, and we'll get you a thoughtful, thorough answer and get back to you if I can't answer your questions tonight. So, consistent with when I came and met with your executive group during the campaign, I have not changed my priorities one whit in terms of the things that I said I wanted to do. We had then and still have a housing affordability crisis. This is very important to me. It gets at the livability of our community. It gets at the ability of people who are moderate and lower income, people who work in our community, to be able to live in our community. And at the end of the day, I don't really have to explain to anybody here in the context of a neighborhood association what displacement does to community institutions, whether it's neighborhood associations, whether it's the local church, whether it's other organizations in the community. Displacement disrupts those institutions we've created for sharing and for fellowship and for community. It's bad for the economy. Displacement makes it very hard for particularly small businesses, and we're a small business town, to retain quality employees. It makes it hard to recruit quality employees if wages are constantly in competition for escalating housing prices. And displacement's just terrible for students. And you know, there are many, many studies out there that show that kids who are repeatedly displaced as their families chase housing affordability, they don't have the same success rates academically as kids who have a stable neighborhood and a stable home. So it's important. There's a couple of things we've done. I'd say, you know, just to tick off three quickly, we collectively have passed the housing bond. That's a about $60 million housing bond. Over the life of that bond, will create about 3,000 housing spaces. 60% of it's reserved for very low income. So that is a strong down payment towards an affordability strategy. And the Bond Oversight Committee is about to have their very first meeting to start talking about what our priorities should be and what our strategies should be and how to best allocate those resources. It was a community-wide ballot measure, so it will be a community-wide effort to determine the best priorities with the guidance, of course, of the Housing Bureau, but ultimately it will be the community that decides how those funds are spent. The second thing we did is a little bit boring, but really important. I called, along with Commissioner Chloe Daly, all of our permitting bureaus together and asked them, how can we improve the way we get workforce and affordable housing on the market? How can we speed it up? How can we reduce the cost? And how can we reduce the bureaucratic red tape and the hassle factor associated with the entire spectrum of services, whether it's the design review process, the permitting process, the fees that are associated with that process, and even subsequently some of the inspections that take place that can often be time-consuming. So those are just a couple of the things we're doing. We obviously passed a relocation ordinance early in our collective tenures. The purpose there was to give people who are just hanging on to rental units by a fingernail a little bit of breathing room for basically 1 year while the legislature sorts out what it wants to do with regard to lifting preemptions either on just cause eviction, something I strongly support, or alternatively rent stabilization processes. And so we don't know where the legislature is going to end with those two items, but we continue to support those efforts down in Salem. The homelessness issue was and is a top priority for me, and as I said before, and I'll say again, there's no quick fix here. There is no magic solution. The city and the county are very aggressively working together through our joint Office of Homelessness Services. We have 3 priorities through that effort. The first is preventive strategies to make sure that people who are close to being priced out are allowed to stay in their homes, and that's basic rent subsidies, rent waivers, helping people if they need a little bit of support for the short term so they don't get evicted from their units. It's also focused on shelter, and as I'm sure everybody here has been paying attention, we have a chronic lack of shelter for people who are living on the streets, in bushes, under overpasses, in doorways. So we've been working very, very diligently with private sector partners to bring more of those shelter services online. And I don't mean just warehousing people, connecting them with nonprofit services, whether it's mental health services, whether it is addiction services, whether it is job training opportunities, sometimes it's child care, sometimes it's domestic violence services. We're trying to do everything we can to get people off the street and keep them off the street. The third area, of course, is creating more supported housing. I'm sure everybody here has had enough experience now with the local homeless population, and you've probably gotten to know some of the people right here in your neighborhood. There are some people that we just have to acknowledge who will never be able to live independently on their own. And unfortunately, the homeless crisis is often just another name for our failure as a nation, as a state, and as a community to provide adequate community-based mental health services. And so we are also working on permanent supportive housing for those who need permanent supportive housing. There's been a couple of very successful initiatives lately around veterans homelessness, around women who are survivors of domestic violence. We've done a really good job of getting families with kids off the streets, but we have a long way to go before we can say we've made a significant impact in the homelessness situation in this city. I think we're doing a lot better than most cities in America, but we're still overwhelmed by the situation. Last year, the Joint Office moved about 4,600 people from the streets to housing. with the supports they needed to remain in that housing and stay successful. So that's a good thing. We created collectively about 600 additional shelter spaces. That's a good thing. The problem is, for the 4,600 people who moved off the streets and went into housing, probably 4,800 new people ended up on the streets. What people tell me and what they're the most upset about isn't that stuff. They assume we're going to continue to do best practice investments to get people into housing. What they're upset about is the manifestations of homelessness. And you're seeing more and more discussions, more public conversation, certainly more articles in the local press about garbage, about permanent structures or semi-permanent structures that are either being lived in or abandoned in public right-of-way. You're seeing more and more about needles as a result of both the opioid and the heroin addiction issue that's sweeping our community like every other community in North America. And we're addressing that too. In my budget, I'm going to address basic things like trash collection, graffiti, making sure that we are cleaning up structures that have been abandoned or garbage by the side of the road that has been abandoned. We are also working with other jurisdictions for the first time to help make sure that we're working in concert. Some of you may have sent me angry emails about the condition of I-84 coming into the city of Portland. I-84 is not the city of Portland's jurisdiction. That is ODOT and a railroad. But I realized, hey, if I'm the mayor and I'm going to get all the calls, we might as well have a little party here, get everybody together and have a confab and talk about how do we work together as jurisdictions. So we pulled together the railroad and ODOT and TriMet and Metro and the city and the Parks Rangers and the police bureaus and others that I'm probably forgetting. And we talked about how do we stop thinking jurisdictionally and start working together to address the issues that concern people. I still believe that it is very important for us to be humane in our approach to the homelessness situation, but we also have to be pragmatic. It's a humanitarian crisis for people who are living on the streets, and they are deserving of our compassion. And we have to appreciate the complexity and the spectrum of issues that are represented by the, quote, homeless, unquote, situation. But we'd be naive if we didn't also acknowledge that it creates livability issues, public health issues, public safety issues, and environmental issues that also need to be addressed in lockstep with that humanitarian approach to helping people get off the streets. So I'll stop on that. I'll move to policing, since that's near and dear to everybody's hearts. My primary thrust is this, and first of all, when I talk about police reform, immediately somebody says, why don't you support the police? I do support the police. It's a very difficult job to be a police officer in America, particularly right now. It is a dangerous job. And with the types of social issues that we're confronting as a nation, first responders, the police, the EMTs, the fire folks, firefighters, they are all frontline first responders now for mental health crises. They're first-line responders for drug addiction issues. It is a difficult job, and I support the men and women of our police bureau in carrying out that difficult job. But I also support reforms that will help build the credibility and the accountability of the police bureau in our community. And when I ran and when I came here, I told you I had 10 issues, 10 reforms that I wanted to see carried out in my tenure as mayor of this city. One of them got checked off through collective bargaining. That was the 48-hour rule. One of them is going to take further collective bargaining. And the other 8, the police chief and I are in agreement that we're going to work together to improve accountability, focus on de-escalation strategies, demilitarize our police bureau, and find every opportunity to go back to a full community policing model. There should be police officers in this room as your neighborhood association is meeting, not to protect you, but to participate. Because you should have neighborhood cops who know the business owners, know the people on the street corners, know the people who run your neighborhood association, know the people in this room who are regularly here, know the issues at the neighborhood level. And that's where the chief and I are going. We're going back to that model because it reduces crime and it improves connections with the community. I could talk about transportation, but I won't because Commissioner Saltzman's now the transportation guy. But I'm sure you'll ask me about potholes, so we'll get to that in due course. I'll stop now. I will stop now and wait for parking and pothole questions to come forth.
Okay, just to lead off on this, there were 5 topic areas that we asked Ted Wheeler to address at tonight's meeting, and I've been given the opportunity for one of each of our board members to address those 5 to lead off the conversation.
Great.
First, Ramona. Versus permanent affordability.
Thanks for being here this evening.
Thank you.
So, I'm a longtime Rose City Park resident. Grew up here, was able to raise my son here, I was able to purchase a family home. But as you mentioned in your opening speech, costs have skyrocketed and are unattainable for most locals. So I'm going to ask you a question about permanent affordability. Are there any permanent affordability programs that the Housing Bureau sponsors or supports that will make sure some of our neighborhood homes remain affordable in perpetuity for future buyers?
The answer to your question is unequivocally yes. Both the Housing Bureau and the Portland Development Commission have programs specifically geared towards creating permanent affordable housing in our community. In some cases, it's through development. In some cases, we just had in the interstate urban renewal area, we just had a new NOFA, which is a notice of funding availability, and we've agreed to fund 3 community-based projects that create permanent affordable housing. Obviously, with the bond that we just passed, that's another opportunity to create permanent affordable housing. And with minimal help from the public sector, there's a lot of nonprofit organizations like Habitat for Humanity, Proud Ground, and others who are creating permanent affordable housing opportunities in our community. And our contribution is really to get out of their way and make sure that the permitting, that the costs associated with the development, that the services provided through Commissioner Bailey's Bureau of Development Services go smoothly. So there are those opportunities. There's other things that we're doing as well. And I certainly don't want to sound like I'm taking credit for all of this, because a lot of this has already been done by the Portland City Council before I even got here. But as you know, there was an inclusionary zoning requirement that was passed by the Portland City Council. So as private sector housing, multifamily housing is built, 20% of it has to reach certain affordability levels, and there's incentives to go very affordable with those. The Portland Comprehensive Plan was put together. That plan actually creates more flexible zoning to create more affordable types of housing, like garden apartments, opens up the opportunity for more duplexes in different areas, smaller units with shared community services. So there are other opportunities that are being explored that provide some more affordable housing. I want to just say sort of a weird cultural thing to this answer as well. There is a demographic issue to the issue of housing that goes beyond neighborhood, that goes beyond ethnicity, that goes beyond gender, and it's related to age. Young people are willing to live in a smaller unit with shared services, like shared common rooms or shared kitchens, shared laundry facilities, whatever. They're willing to live like that in exchange for affordability as close to employment and the cultural center as possible. And there's resistance to those kinds of flexible housing arrangements because that's just not the way we've done things. I would encourage you, as the economy changes, as the millennial generation becomes more of a force, and as we acknowledge that their preferences may be different than our generation's preferences, we consider flexibility so that they have that same opportunity to come into a neighborhood, maybe not to buy a big 4-room house with a yard, but at least to get a toehold in the community. And as your former state treasurer, I have to say, you know, while it's great to be a renter, it's even better to be the equity holder. Because the way wealth is generated in this economy is through home ownership. And it's the #1 way that American families create intergenerational wealth sharing. It's through you purchasing a house, hanging on to it for many years, and then either your kids get to use it or you sell it and it becomes sort of part of your family's financial assets. And if we have a generation of young people who are perpetually just renters, they never get that toehold into equity. And what it really is one more intergenerational transfer of wealth from really young people to much older people. So I would just encourage you, at the end people always say, what can we do to help? One thing I would say is, think about more flexible types of housing, more flexible zoning that may not be consistent with the way you're used to things, but could be really, really helpful to the next generation that wants to continue to live here in the city of Portland. Sorry, really long answer, I apologize. I had too much coffee today, apparently.
Hold on. Let me go through our list and then we'll open up for other questions.
And I'll be briefer, I promise.
Okay. I have a question about what it means to be a sanctuary city. I bet everybody knows that Portland, you have actually declared that Portland is a sanctuary city.
Yes.
And I suspect, and I think my suspicion is right. I was about to say that I think many people, if not everyone in Rose City Park and our surrounding neighborhoods, really support that declaration and are proud to live in a sanctuary city. We wouldn't want it any other way. But if you could just comment on what is the declaration actually meant to the city so far, and what plans do you have if our president follows through on, I'll call them threats, because they felt that way to me, to cut funding to cities that don't support federal immigration policies?
Great. Thank you for the question, and I appreciate your support, your open support for that, because I will tell you, it is not universally popular, and judging from the angry emails and angry calls and Facebook posts coming from Portlanders, I will tell you, it is not universally popular in the city of Portland, even if it is popular in this particular neighborhood. That being said, I am not going to ever back off of the sanctuary city status because it's the right thing to do. And here's what it actually means. In terms of the actual ordinance that we passed, it reiterates our commitment to state law, which says that local law enforcement agencies cannot be compelled by the federal government to enforce federal immigration law. And in fact, it restricts the ability of local law enforcement agencies to do that. It further provides training for all city employees so that they understand how to act and how to respond if residents or fellow employees have issues with regard to ICE. It also directs the city to look for specific opportunities to support community-based organizations that are addressing the sanctuary issue. For us, that meant an initial $50,000 contribution to the Metropolitan Public Defenders to help people who are caught up in the, I will call it the ICE cycle, just because I have a weird sense of humor and I think that's funny. In the ICE cycle, to help them address some of their legal issues. But what it really does is it states, along with all of the other major West Coast cities, that we are not going to roll over for this administration. We are not going to let them separate families. We are not going to let them talk about things like building a wall. I mean, my gosh, I never thought I would say nice things about Ronald Reagan, but he must be spinning in his grave. I mean, he was the one who stood in front of a wall and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. What happened in just a few short years? We are also taking legal action against the Trump administration, and I have some really good news on that front. But first I'll tell you what we did. The city of Seattle and the city of San Francisco sued the Trump administration, and their format, their arguments are exactly our arguments. And so I directed our legal staff to either consider the possibility of us filing our own lawsuit, or alternatively, what would it look like if we joined as a co-plaintiff on either Seattle or San Francisco's lawsuit. And it so happened that Seattle was a little more appropriate for us. I thought it'd be great to send a collective message from the Pacific Northwest that we're not only not lying down on this, we're going to actively fight you in court, because we believe that the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution gives us the right to legally defy what we think is an illegal and unconstitutional executive order out of the White House. So while we were having that conversation, a wonderful thing happened in San Francisco today, which is a federal judge basically injuncted the Trump administration in the San Francisco lawsuit. So today we were in conversations with our friends in Seattle to figure out what does this mean in terms of our next legal strategy. We're talking about it, and if we need to all simply sign up with San Francisco and San Mateo, that's exactly what we will do. But the West Coast is becoming more aggressive on this issue, even as the Trump administration is becoming aggressive. The only funds that we think are at risk, and by the way, weirdly enough, Jeff Sessions did not add Portland to the list, at least the initial list of cities to be targeted by the Trump administration. I don't think they've forgotten us. I think they're saving us for something special, is what I think is going on there. Because San Francisco, I don't believe, was on the list. I don't believe Seattle was on the list. I mean, it's a really weird omission. So they're saving us for something else. But even if they were able to claw back all of our DOJ funds, and that is not clear, that's $3 million for the city of Portland. And while I will never be caught publicly saying $3 million isn't a lot of money, we can figure out, if we need to, how to make things work without that $3 million. I'd rather not, but I'm pretty comfortable we can. And our values in this community are worth a lot more than the $3 million that the Trump administration thinks they can take from us, which they can't because it's patently illegal.
Thank you. Welcome to our neighborhood.
Thank you for having me.
As a small business owner for 25 years and an Oregon Trail native, I am deeply concerned about the fast growth in Portland, creating the high density and subsequent traffic congestion. I know that growth is inevitable, but I believe that purposeful growth can be achieved. This growth has caused an affordable housing crisis, as you've mentioned, and what I'm not hearing as much about is commercial affordability problems for us small business owners. My business, Paper Jam Press, is located in the Beaumont Village Business District on Northeast Fremont. We have lost 4 to 5 businesses to high rents over the last 2 to 3 years. And I'm sure you know the statistic, Close to 90% of the businesses in Portland are small businesses with 6 or fewer employees. 90% of the businesses in Portland have 6 or fewer employees. When I talk to my fellow business owners, one of their main concerns right now is rising rents. As our new mayor, what are your plans to manage this growth as it pertains to commercial affordability? I have part 2. Hang in there with me. In addition, connected to the growth in our cities is the growth in the neighborhood business districts. In a 10-block area up on Fremont, we have 2 apartment buildings with almost 100 units combined. One is in the process of being built, one is built, with a total of 12 parking spaces. I know that we all need to get out of our cars to decrease our use of fossil fuels. I think a lot of us would agree with that. But when parking becomes too difficult, the businesses can lose sales because people get frustrated and they can't find a place to park. So this jeopardizes our ability to stay in business. What is your vision and plan for making sure the developers are required to put in ample parking spaces?
I didn't see that one coming.
That's it.
Okay, so let me do both in turn. First of all, with regard to commercial space, I am actually extremely worried about the loss of commercial space. And let me preface this by saying I don't have a great answer. I do not have an A+ answer. And this would be a great opportunity for the neighborhood business districts and the Portland Development Commission and advocates for small business like Venture Portland and the Main Street Alliance and others to come together and start brainstorming and help us find some good strategies. I've got a couple of wacky ideas, just for starters. Number one, I've already directed the Portland Development Commission, which is in my portfolio, and they're very happy to do this, to continue to work to find ways to shift their strategy towards the development of neighborhoods that are complete, including small businesses. And they've been really innovative. They have the neighborhood prosperity initiatives. They've supported some very specific types of small business development, like the Portland Mercado and 72nd and Foster. But there's other things we can do. Here's like a crazy idea. So we passed this inclusionary zoning ordinance for housing, because housing affordability really is the crisis du jour with regard to construction right now. Developers are always looking for incentives. What if we were giving them incentive towards the inclusionary housing requirements to maintain certain types of spaces in their facility, whether it's a community institution, whether it's a culturally specific business, whether it's a critical maker space. How do we prevent every, and no disrespect to the Gap, but how do we prevent every single corner space becoming a Starbucks or a Gap? And I am keenly aware that in the industrial reserves, we're moving away from sort of heavy industrial and machinery towards maker space. It's still industrial, but it's reflective of sort of a new economy and the next generation of what industrial space is. And we have economic incentives that we're putting in place to make that happen. We should be thinking the same thing about neighborhood businesses and neighborhood retail and creative businesses, and we should go beyond that. When I talk to the artist community, the first thing they ask for isn't subsidies as artists. The first thing they ask for is make sure we don't lose our venues. Performing arts, musicians, and those who are gallery owners and operators say, this is a very low threshold business from a profitability perspective. My rent goes up about 2%, I'm done. And it's not me, it's the other 150 galleries on this side of the river. So I think you're right to think about this. I'd like to continue to work with the neighborhood business associations, the business districts, and the PDC to see if we can't come up with some Portland first creative strategies. Because frankly, no city on the West Coast has figured this one out. We're all struggling with the rise in commercial spaces, and there is a truth to the economic belief that as you build density, it drives out mom and pop businesses because of the economics around the retail space. We've got to protect that retail space just as we're protecting affordable housing. But I'm just being honest and telling you, I don't know exactly how to do that yet.
I have a report that showcases San Francisco, Seattle, and some other West Coast cities and things they've done, so I'll send it to you.
Great. And I know the PDC folks are all over this stuff, and I'm sorry I'm not a little better versed, but it is an important conversation. I at least want to acknowledge that. I'm happy to work with you on that because it's super important. Parking. Did I mention that Commissioner Dan Saltzman is the Transportation Commissioner? So here's the deal on parking. So the City Council, as you know, fought some huge battles in recent years around parking. And the first battle they fought was around parking minimum requirements for development, right? And so there were parking minimums that were in place by order of the Portland City Council. And then a lot of people in the community rose up and said, what the heck are you doing? Why are you doing that? Because the bigger problem isn't parking. The bigger problem is the affordability and the supply of affordable housing. And the fact of the matter is, parking adds significantly to the cost of affordable housing. So Mayor Hales then, having taken that beating, went back and encouraged the Portland City Council to eliminate the parking minimums. So that's where we are today. I have two things to say on this subject, and Commissioner Saltzman might fundamentally disagree with me. So I'm not speaking for Dan, and I'm not speaking for the Transportation Bureau. A little bit of flexibility is a good thing. And there are strategies to encourage it. Northwest Portland had this problem. I'm not sure it's quite as bad as the problem is here, but they have a lot of shops and a lot of destination retail and a lot of tourism. And they were very concerned about what was happening with the business mix, so their neighborhood association worked with the Transportation Bureau, and they came up with a parking plan that they thought was appropriate for them to protect parking in the neighborhood for residents, while at the same time encouraging turnover in the retail district, predominantly Northwest 21st and Northwest 23rd, but really that whole area down there. And it's had a few bumps, but by and large, they're really happy with the plan they came up with. I'm not sure I would just simply take that plan and move it here, but I think there's an opportunity for a discussion through the neighborhood association, the business district with your neighbors to see whether there isn't some sort of a plan that might work for you in that regard. A completely different strategy, the Central East Side Industrial District. They have actually added a surcharge onto the parking meters that they pay for, that goes into a fund that they are using to fund a single regional parking facility because there is a demonstrable mess down there. And that's still to be sorted out by the Portland City Council. But I want you to know people are thinking about it in different ways. But I want to put a marker down. The debate, parking versus housing, it's really over. That piece of the conversation is over. When younger families or younger people say they want to locate here, the first thing they're saying isn't, boy, I wish I had another parking space or had access to a parking space. What they're saying is, I can't afford to live in this city. And so the city, meaning the debate that happened over the last 3 years, actually made a choice. And the choice was affordability in housing over access to parking. I just want you to be aware that is a real dynamic and it is a real choice, and it was made with full community involvement. Now, when we start looking at the micro level, when we start looking at the micro level, I can outlast you. When we start looking at the micro level, different neighborhoods are going to have, one size won't fit all. And so I'm very open to looking at district plans the same way Northwest did. I think they were very successful, and I welcome proposals from Rose City as well.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions, and I would prefer it to be from someone in our neighborhood. Jim?
This is right on topic.
Okay.
We had an election in 2014. Neighborhood density was on the ballot. And Portlanders voted against increasing neighborhood density by a 3-to-1 margin. And of course, the parking problem is a result of neighborhood density. So my question to you is, after we voted 3-to-1 against more density in our neighborhoods, why is the city still shoving density down our throats? Thank you.
So the Portland plan, the 2035 plan, which has been vetted, it tails off of the Portland plan, and there was extensive public engagement on the Portland plan
Not really.
over the last several years. I don't know, because I wasn't here either. So I'm just telling you, the Portland 2035 plan, which is, I was down to state treasurer. I read probably 15, 20, 30 articles on various public discussions about the comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plan, at its core, does increase density in certain areas of the city. Areas where I think it is appropriate, the downtown core, transportation corridors, some of the town centers. I think those are the most appropriate areas for density. And in the neighborhoods themselves, I've always said, the density should be appropriate to the neighborhood. So I've supported some things that, maybe some of you don't. I support auxiliary dwelling units. I think they're a relatively inexpensive way that fits in with the character of the neighborhood to add more housing options in a city that is going to become more popular and is going to become more crowded regardless of what we do. And as somebody who asked the question earlier said, you can't stop Portland from growing. It's going to continue to grow, and there are going to be a lot more people here. And the question is, how expensive do you want it to be?
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you, sir, for coming.
Thank you.
You hear some of the frustration here in the room, and I have personal frustration. It seems like there may be a neighborhood process or a community process, and then at the last minute, things are changed, just like when the mayor dropped the minimum parking. There's a whole process of which our chair was involved with for years, trying to work this through, and then all of a sudden it changed. You had no opportunity for input. There was another issue regarding the middle housing issue that happened, increasing the density and changing within neighborhoods that, like, basically when you do, what is it, a quarter mile or so many feet from a certain area, it's going to overlay the whole Rose City Park neighborhood. So it's a little disingenuous to say that you had extensive neighborhood input when after extensive neighborhood input at the very end, it changes. So I don't think the discussion of parking and building is over. And I don't think the discussion of density in our neighborhoods is over. Okay, we feel like the rug was pulled out from under us.
And that is, and to be clear, I wasn't here, so I will trust that you are completely correct, that you were shut out of the conversation.
They always do that.
Reflect this, because you are right about a certain point. I can absolutely validate and appreciate what you're saying with this sudden changes in the parking requirements. That did seem like a series of sudden back and forths. And it's not just the neighborhoods that have been screaming about that decision. Some of the people who build affordable housing and plan projects and all that, they're also concerned about it. And so we've had market rate housing folks come in and say, listen, we can't sell our units if there isn't parking. associated with them. There's not a market for, a certain price point, and we tell the people, oh, by the way, there's no parking. So, there is a balance and a give or take that has to happen here, and we need to be smart about it and transition thoughtfully. It's never a good idea to go from A to Z overnight. And you're not the only group that has reflected that concern to me. I hear it all over the place.
So what are you going to do now that you know that we all have this concern? What happens now?
Well, I don't know. I mean, because the 2035 plan is already, it's done.
Scrap it. Scrap it.
You're a very important person that was made by people. So now you know that you're really upset. So how can you, if you listen, how can you change that? Because you say.
So I cannot scrap the 2035 plan. It's done.
I'm sure you
It's
can.
done. No, I cannot.
Yes,
I'm
you
one
can.
of 5 city commissioners. Absolutely cannot. So let's talk about what's
Maybe we
possible.
need an initiative.
You could do that. You could do that. You could do an initiative. You could run a campaign and you could see if you could win. I'm not confident you would. A better strategy from my perspective, what I'm proposing, is if you as a community create your own overlay district like Northwest did, or CEIC is trying to do, that would be a pragmatic approach. I'll be honest, trying to reopen the entire 2035 plan, there were tens of thousands of people engaged in that process over a period of many, many years. There were some hard-fought battles that went into that plan. I've got no dog in the fight. I had nothing to do with it. But I'm just telling you, if you're asking me, can I just reopen the plan and scrap it? No. To be honest, no, I cannot. I'm sorry?
There's no chance for modification?
There are chances. Absolutely there are.
Because that
Yes.
would be very helpful and appropriate. My children go to school in Northwest Portland, and it is not working that beautifully, so I beg to differ with you.
And that's fine. So again, I gave you my best shot. If you can come up with a plan, if you want to come and ask the city council if they'll scrap the 2035 plan, that's an option.
Just
Okay.
scrap the density.
And I think on that note,
Thank you. You may
We have a charge.
hate me, but have it back anyway. Even if you hate me, I'm your mayor for the next 3 3/4 years. Thank you. This will have a place of honor right inside the front door to the mayor's office at Portland City Hall. I appreciate this. This is very kind of you. Thank you. Thanks, Mayor.